Hello. Oh, good morning. It's working. Good morning and welcome, everyone. We're going to start already as we are on a tight schedule. Some of our speakers will be joining us online. So I'll just kick this off, and meanwhile, people can continue gathering. So my name is Eugenia Kovalova, and I'm one of the co-founders of Africo, an organization that is hosting this event today. And I want to tell you, welcome. A couple of technical notes. The event will be recorded and streamed online. So for our online audience, we have a lot of people joining, watching us on YouTube and social media. And of course, I'm really happy that this room is filling in and we have a face-to-face presence as well. I'm happy to kind of kick off this final event. I'll say a couple of words about why it's the final event, but I just want to acknowledge my colleague, Lukas Ivanauskas, who's been the true driver of this project, even though I'll be hosting the first part, but I think it's Lukas who has to have a lot of credit for why this project has been happening successfully. So I'll be your host for the first part of the program, and then we'll have a 15 minutes break where you can enjoy African coffee in the room over there. And I will kick off with a short presentation of this project, which we call Baltics-EU-Africa Trialogue project. So some of you know who we are as an organization, Africo, but I would really like to give you a quick reminder, and for those of you who don't know who we are, just to introduce ourselves as an organization. So we are a Baltic-based research and consultancy center, and our mission is to connect and reflect Baltics and Africa. We're doing this since 2015, and our guiding principle is building beneficial partnerships between the Baltic countries and African countries. We have a sort of dual identity, so to say. We are both practitioners, but we also like to reflect a lot. And this is also a principle that has been guiding our Trialogue project that you will hear about more today. Right? And let me quickly introduce what is the Trialogue project. The aim of this initiative was to facilitate a more active engagement of the Baltic states and participation in building of the EU-Africa partnership. And we believe that the Baltics can have a unique voice in this conversation. They can bring new ideas, they can maybe even disrupt somewhat this relationship, and also at the same time, Baltics can really benefit from this opportunity. So the project started, the idea of the project started in 2018, where we had our first discussion involving Baltic policymakers. And at the time, it was just an idea, but then it developed in a full project. And one of the questions that also kicked off this idea, how can a little frog fly? And this is a quote from Professor Baldur Thorhallsson from University of Iceland. So he's questioning how small states with its limited abilities and capacities can contribute and shape certain policies within the EU. And today we're asking a question, so will a little frog fly finally? And we believe it's possible when small states can cooperate and use their limited resources in a really smart way. So the Trialogue project is guided by a magic number 3. So it's about the 3 Baltic states cooperating between each other, but it's also about this cooperation between the Baltics, the EU, and Africa. Let me jump quickly into what we have done until now, because we are now at the final stage of our project. So our premise was that we will gather policymakers, practitioners, NGO representatives, and private sector from the 3 Baltic countries, and we will involve them in meaningful discussion. We will analyze how they perceive this relationship. We will analyze what obstacles they see to a bigger involvement of the Baltic states. So we had what we call national roundtables in each of the Baltic states, so Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And at the same time, we were also conducting a more analytical work. We've been having interviews with African counterparts, with representatives of EU institutions, and also with Baltic policymakers. So we had around 50 interviews conducted. And these interviews have been informing our national roundtables, and the other way around. The information that we gathered in this national roundtables have been informing our analysis and the questions that we asked. So we came up with a number of challenges that we identified and some recommendations to answer to those challenges. And just last week, we had a Baltic roundtable, so inviting all of those who participated in the national roundtables to sort of listen to our recommendations and validate them. Those recommendations are not coming only from us and our analysis. Some of them were actually suggested by the policymakers themselves. So here is just a quick visual aid for how these roundtables looked like. Most of them happened during COVID, so most of them were online, and we did have some hybrid events in Tallinn. So this was our methodology. Again, both practical, having interviews, having roundtables, and analytical, actually doing research and analyzing what has been said and what we have found out. And why we are today in the final event, because this is everything that has happened until now. And the final stage is presenting our findings for the audience here in Brussels, hoping that we can have African voices also commenting on our recommendations. So let me jump into recommendations. We actually have 8 of them, but today we will present only 3. Again, the magic number 3. So one of the recommendations is to have a seasonal school, let's say a winter school for Baltic policymakers, researchers, NGO representatives. And this recommendation, it tackles the challenge of a lack of knowledge, something that has been identified by the Baltics, that there is a lack of particular knowledge about the dynamics within Africa, about particularities of specific states, and we feel that this could be a really good way to address that challenge. And I'm actually happy to say that Africa will host such school already in the coming year. The second recommendation is what we call a Baltic district approach. We suggest that the 3 Baltic countries can join their forces and cooperate on a specific development cooperation project in a specific location. Actually, this idea is an inspiration from an approach that Iceland has been having in its development cooperation. So this recommendation has resonated really well with the Baltic counterparts. Last week, it has been mentioned as one of the ideas that is most tangible and that is very attractive, because it can strengthen what we call, let's say, a Baltic image. It can allow to draw limited resources together and for the countries to cooperate and actually have a very tangible impact in the one specific location. So as you see, it tackles the challenge of, first of all, involvement on the ground in Africa, but it also tackles the challenge of Baltics being a new and relatively unknown actor in Africa, because it allows a very concrete pathway to getting known on the field. As one of the African counterparts in the interview said, the Baltic states have an opportunity to role model bilateral cooperation and influence better EU-Africa engagement. And the third recommendation that I'm going to mention today is something that we call sensible experimentation approach. So this is a suggestion we have that could be applied to programming and implementation of various international partnership initiatives by the Baltic states, with an aspiration that those projects that have gone through this pilot phase and have been impactful and successful can actually mature into full-fledged EU-funded projects. And the problem that we are tackling with this specific suggestion is that there are a number of obstacles within the EU structure of funding for small actors. And this is something that has been a recurring theme among our interviewees, that as small NGO, for example, they find it extremely difficult to get their ideas through the gatekeepers of EU funding. And it's a vicious circle. You don't get experience, you cannot apply for bigger funding. You don't get bigger funding, you don't get experience. So this is one of our recommendations, to have this sensible experimentation approach where we provide sort of seed funding for smaller projects that are oriented towards innovation, for example, growing these small projects that they can go ahead and apply for EU funding. I'm running quickly because through the recommendations, they will all be available in the report that Africa will share widely after we conclude this project. This is just to kind of give you a taste of what we came up with. And I just want to, my last point that kind of ties and will go through as a red line through all the discussions today is a question of values. This is an underlying theme that came up in our discussions and interviews. What values will define Baltics in Africa? On one hand, there is a sentiment from African counterparts that they are tired of being preached to and being patronized by presented ways of doing things. So this has been a theme through our interviews with African counterparts. On the other hand, the Baltics stand firmly with their values. And I think it has become even more apparent with an ongoing aggression, Russian aggression against Ukraine. What values we are promoting, what values we are standing for. And then on the third hand, there are some pragmatic considerations from the private sector. So we don't have an answer to this. This is just to raise a question, and I hope that especially the discussion in the second part today will tackle this question and will perhaps provide some way forward. I will end here as we are supposed to have Rasa, but I think my colleagues are telling me that Rasa is not available right now. So I'll invite Daniel Erik Scher, from an Estonian ambassador at large for economic cooperation with Africa, for his keynote and some insights into what Estonia thinks about all of this.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. First of all, Your Excellencies, dear guests, thank you for attending this excellent event today. Thank you for Africa for organizing such an important event. And I guess it's very difficult for me to be the first thing in the morning to open the event from the country perspectives. And I will try to do my best. Hopefully, it's also interesting. So I wanted to start a little bit about Estonia's history in Africa. The history already goes to the beginning of the 17th century. The first known presences were also very much business related. For example, we had Estonians in the Dutch companies operating in Africa in that time. We had them in the Swedish companies that were operating in Africa. We also had a link to, for example, Alexander Pushkin's great-grandfather, Ibrahim Abram Hannibal, served in Pärnu and in Tallinn in the middle of the 18th century. So already the contacts from different areas. In the 19th century, we had more of a missionary presence. We're also one of the missionaries published the first Maasai language spelling book. things started to intensify after we gained independence in 1918 with relations with South Africa, Liberia, Ethiopia, and Egypt. And Estonia's main export to Africa at that time were wood and wood products, especially paper. And the main export partners were, again, an interesting list: Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Angola, and Mozambique. So again, prior to this time, where we are now, we already had these contacts, and they were very pragmatic, very much linked to economic cooperation. We also had several people, Estonians are sort of innovative, engineering thinking, and there's one story that apparently the emperor of Ethiopia had an Estonian who was in charge of all of his car and machinery park, because, you know, again, Estonia's, you know, using the ingenuity to manage these type of systems. And then prior to World War II, Estonia had 6 honorary consulates in 4 countries: Algeria, Morocco, South Africa, and Egypt. So again, we already sensed the importance of the continent. At the moment, we have 1 embassy, unfortunately, in Egypt, only 1. 8 honorary consulates, but we are already working on improving that number. We have changed our approach to honorary consuls. The numbers for consular services are very limited, and especially with the Lisbon Treaty allowing our citizens to approach any embassy in Africa, the EU delegation, the need for consular assistance has greatly reduced. So now we're really starting to focus on how our honorary consuls can help us build economic relations with the African countries. Currently, our exports to Africa are somewhere ranging from 150 to 200 million euros per year. A lot linked to cereals, wheat. Our biggest trade partner last year was Nigeria, where we sent wheat to. Again, wood and forest products remain important, machinery and oils. But I think the most interesting are the 2 growth sectors, so e-solutions, e-government, and then green tech. Those are really the companies that are really interested in finding out what's going on, what are the new developments on the continent, how to work together. And also our state chancellery has just started a new strategy where it will no longer be only the digital revolution, but it'll be the double revolution, the green and digital hand in hand. So again, here we see much opportunities to cooperate with countries in Africa. And looking forward, on February 2021, we launched the first comprehensive strategy for engaging with Africa. It did a review of what the company's interests are, what are our development cooperation priorities, and also looked at the bilateral relations. And we identified 4 countries that are priority countries: Kenya, Uganda, Namibia, and Botswana. Of course, with the current situation in the world, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, food security, energy prices, the Green Deal, we're going to be reviewing this strategy. So we're going to be looking before the end of the year. We're going to update this and also look to see how to update the strategic approach that we'll be taking here. We understand that our friends on the continent are interested in having contacts with us, and so we understand that we have to be more active and really bring our boots on the ground. And I think that I think it also came out in the report very clearly that the big challenge is the footfall. If we can't be there permanently with an embassy, the continent is large, 54 countries. How do you make those choices? Then we have to go onto the ground. Our president, our former president Kersti Kaljulaid, when we visited 4 countries in Africa, when they asked where will you open your next embassy, the president, she answered, well, look, do you want us to have an embassy with some nice limousines, with some diplomats, or do you want us to do development cooperation or look at ways to cooperate with you for that same money? What would you prefer? Because being a small country with a small budget, we can't do both. So again, we are interested I will be now every month in Africa, going into the field, supporting our companies also, but also looking for different cooperation opportunities. And now the same messaging is to our ministers, to the vice ministers, to mayors. The cities are also very interested in cooperation at university level. So we're really trying to create an interest in Africa. And one of my jobs is mapping the business interests and opportunities as well. They change very quickly. For the strategy we did the mapping in 2020. But again, if I think there was a quote about how the companies will decide themselves what they do in exactly the same way. One year they will say that this country's country X is a priority. Next year will be country Y. So we're trying to make a focus to build relations with certain countries that will also create economic cooperation opportunities. And some ideas regarding cooperation. So from the EU-AU or EU-Africa cooperation standpoint, is I think that the three Baltic countries have a very specific experience after the restoration of independence, going through the reform processes. And I think another area that we haven't talked very much about is about the free trade agreement. Almost all countries in Africa have signed the African Free Trade Agreement. And for example, when we joined the European Union, I mean, it was us joining a free trade area. So how did we put this into place? How did we react? What were the experiences that we had? And I think this is something that we need to do more, is really share our reform experiences. And of course, our leaders who have done this are also still active. And what I feel in Africa is often it's again the leader-to-leader contact that will clinch the final decisions and will push us towards the right direction. And I think that another point is that we really need to implement the digital for development concept. When it was first agreed upon from all of the DGs in the Commission, it was agreed that all of the projects that take place in Africa will have a digital component to it. And I think that you can add the green aspect now to that as well. So whenever we're planning on doing development cooperation at an EU level, Team Europe, digital and green should always be in those aspects. In terms of the 3B cooperation, I think there are several areas. Visas, there are some countries where the three Baltics or some of the how can we say, the newer, even though we're old members of the EU already, but some of us do not have visa-free in travel in some of the African countries, even though some of the other EU countries do, so we can cooperate here. I think consultations are a really good option. I visited the Indian Ocean island countries and also the Commission, and I think that here in Brussels is a good opportunity, for example, to have the 3B with the 4 countries from the Indian Ocean Commission to even once a year just to talk about what are the interests, what are the worries. I mean, at the end of the day, the 3B are at the decision-making table in the European Union. We have a say like everybody else, and I think that this is one of the messaging that we need to pass to our African friends. Joint visits, missions, and I think joint visibility and communications. So I mean, it's not only in terms of the school option, but I think in general events, if there's one happening in Estonia or Latvia, the same people should be doing the three Baltic countries. And what we have to avoid is that the same Africanists, specializing in Africa, the same people are attending all the time. We want to get to the new people, the people who are not aware of it, because I remember that my first time arriving in Africa and Burundi for the elections in 2004, and I will never forget when the door opened and the smell of the fresh the ground, the smell coming of the richness of the tropical forest coming in from the door. I will never forget that smell. And I think the more people that we can get getting this bug of loving Africa is the best way for us to build our relations. And my last point is that we're talking a lot about what we can bring to the continent, but we need to talk about more what the continent can bring to us. Learning from the African experiences. I think one of the things that we do best is that we have our open door policy. We don't have a historical baggage when we go to Africa. Our door is open, we listen. We share our experiences, negative and positive. We don't always paint a rosy picture, and we have a lot to learn from our friends in Africa. So I think this is a good start to the direction that we're going, and I think we just have to push a little bit harder. So thank you very much, and I'm happy at the break to talk to anyone who's interested in cooperating with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador, for your keynote. And I'm happy to hear that some of the taglines are resonating with you, the 3B cooperation in visibility, for example. So unfortunately, Rasa Yuknevich, the vice chair of the group of the European People Party at the European Parliament, was not able to join us. She was rushing to the airport, and I think she already on the airplane. So that both gives us a couple of extra minutes, perhaps for some questions after we hear the other two keynotes. So I will invite now the ambassador of Latvia to the European Union, representative of the Political and Security Committee, Ivars Lasis, please.
Thank you. Thank you, and indeed, thank you so much for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak on the Latvian perspective. And I also appreciate the Estonian ambassador's comments. And well, Latvia doesn't have an ambassador at large yet, but I hope and I believe it's a very good example to follow, actually. So I hope it is something we take away also from this discussion today. But and we also, like Estonia, we have had our relationship with Africa in the past, but I will try to focus more on what we do now and what are the prospects for future. And I will divide my speech in three parts. Probably I will start with how we are stepping up as well. And then I will focus on areas of possible cooperation and areas where we are cooperating now. And then on the Russian aggression in Ukraine and how this impacts our relationship with the African countries. So on the outreach and stepping up, this is indeed a very good opportunity. It is indispensable that we do cooperate now with African countries much more, given the geopolitical challenges, what we are facing, all of us. And we are actually stepping up considerably. We have had political consultations and visits to Africa this year, to Zambia, Angola. We are planning more to South Africa, to Namibia, to Kenya, Tanzania. Hopefully we can manage it. And just last week, our foreign minister and the president had a very fruitful exchange with a number of African foreign ministers in New York as well. Of course, we look at this very much from the point of view of the United Nations Security Council non-permanent seat candidature, for which Latvia is applying and will be applying in 26-27. So we are stepping up this engagement with African countries, and we believe that when we start our campaign next year, this outreach and cooperation with the African countries will even expand at a bigger pace. So, and it will also provide, I believe, a very good foundation and to mobilize the efforts and in the business community, also the political community in Latvia and the Baltics in general, to open up more to cooperation with Africa. And given the the challenges and the opportunities we have. And actually this year is the first time we have also in Latvia provided development cooperation aid to African countries. So we will put a greater emphasis on this, and so far Latvia has mostly worked with the Central Asian and the Eastern Partnership countries, given our historical experience. So, and we believe we can contribute to good governance, rule of law, and democracy in making it work and strengthen on the African continent. Our expertise in development cooperation ranges from capacity building of public administration to development of e-governance solutions. So those are areas where, but there are many more, of course. And the first time, as I said, this is the first time we have provided development aid assistance to African countries. So it's Zambia and Namibia. It is about empowering women and girls in the business sector, making them more able to work. And so we will focus on this, which should be an inclusive and sustainable effort to also to contribute to a better business environment in the countries. About my next point about the areas of cooperation, lots of untapped potential indeed. So we have lots of knowledge to share, given also our transition from the Soviet system to a market economy. So we can focus on digitalization, climate change, good governance, access to education, economic and business development, advancement of women's involvement in political, economic, and social spheres. So those are areas where we are likely to contribute. And of course, we also wish to have a representative office, an embassy in sub-Saharan Africa. So far, we have only one in Egypt, which we are sharing actually with the Estonian colleagues as well, and it works well, co-locating. So yes, and I think when we have one in sub-Saharan Africa, it should also provide assistance to those business efforts. Economic cooperation can also, we believe, help implement EU-African Union summit commitments, which is very good, and many of the Latvian businesses are already engaged in service provision in Africa, from optic cables to mobile payments to various ID card and biometric verification systems. So we also believe that by offering innovative and smart solutions and investing in digital skills, we can contribute to the implementation of the EU-Africa Summit commitments, which supports Africa towards a strong, inclusive, green, and digital recovery and transformation. Also, yeah, and that should also, of course, contribute to improving business climate. Another very promising area and a challenging area for cooperation is climate change. It is important to focus on this given the challenges Africa is experiencing. It is prone to climate change very much. So we are willing to offer our experience in afforestation and reforestation, climate smart agriculture, energy efficiency, and development of sustainable energy, as well as monitoring of combating marine pollution. So, third, about Russia's war in Ukraine, and that is really a very important issue, and the Estonian ambassador already focused on that as well. We believe it has disrupted in many ways Africa's promising economic growth and recovery from COVID pandemic, and it has increased food and fuel costs, insecurity in the continent. So when I think it just shows how connected we all are when the war breaks out, and it affects all of us. We strongly condemn Russia's unprovoked and unjustified invasion, and it is totally unacceptable how Russia manipulates hunger and energy resources, boosting inflation and harming the most vulnerable communities in the world. In our view, and in the view of many, there can be no compromise on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And indeed, we also had our experience with the Soviet Union, with Russia. Baltic states lived through the dark pages in our history, and even after regaining independence, Russia continued to meddle into our relations and exert its malign influence. So we need to push back on this and to avoid this happening and vigorously do this. And I think EU is doing a good job, and it will continue to do a good job, and we should engage the African countries as well. It is very worrying that Russia is now expanding, and its manipulative leverage in so many African countries. So we should engage with those countries, explain that it's the war causing the problems, not the sanctions. So it's one of the many aspects, and we believe that the Baltic states indeed are well placed to contribute to this. And also about the broader international system, there are many things which unite the Baltics and the EU and the African countries. It's the interest in principles and values, the values-based system, international rules-based order, and as well as sovereignty and territorial integrity. Those are important for the small states like the Baltics and many small states in Africa as well, but not only small states, but we should bet on this and expand our outreach, because it's totally unacceptable that Russia, being a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, is violating the borders and waging a war of aggression. And this, of course, goes hand in hand with our development goals, which is also to contribute with our expertise in building better governance and democracy and rule of law. And of course, strategic communication, it's an area where we also feel we can contribute. We are given our experience and also the efforts the EU is doing. On the missions and operations as well, because just to say a few words, growth and prosperity is not possible without peace and security. So Latvia has been involved in missions and operations on the African continent, and we will continue to do it, and we are quite determined to contribute to this in future. And also wish to point out to our African friends that despite the war in Ukraine, and probably because of it, actually, we remain committed to working with Africa. It is very important for us that we strengthen our partnership. And finally, as well, to Africa colleagues, I want to thank for the recommendations you have provided. And although we believe, yes, we are still a novelty as a country to work with Africa, but I think we are eager to expand our cooperation, doing it bilaterally, doing it jointly with the Baltics, with the other two countries, and within the framework of the EU. So we welcome your recommendations, and especially those working to increase the capacity, to provide training to Baltic policymakers, and also to create a database for those people. So we look forward to working with you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Actually, you mentioned one of our other recommendations from those 8 ones, where we suggest creating an expertise bank, so gathering people who have expertise in Africa and making it available to the Baltic states. But as I said, we will share this, the final report when it's ready, and we will share the recommendations. So thank you for your comments. Thank you for being here. I will now ask to to stream a keynote address of Professor Carlos Lopez. He's a honorary professor at Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. He's a development economist, and he was also a former high representative of the Commission of the African Union. So he has a welcome word for us here today.
Greetings to you all. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to participate in this conference, although I'm not present physically. This is a very good option for someone that is living so far away from the Baltic states. That doesn't mean in my part of the world we don't know how much this particular group of countries has increased its participation in the international scene and has given an example of how a transition can actually produce structural transformation. And in Africa, our biggest battle is actually how to achieve structural transformation. The possibilities for us to industrialize, to take advantage of some megatrends that are going to make possible for Africa to integrate global value chains in a way that is not just based on commodity dependence, not based on the old colonial structure of the economy that basically has all the infrastructure, education, institutions geared towards rent-seeking and commodities exports, to a society that is based on an economy that is modern, with industrial type of relations that are going to be capable of so producing not only jobs, but institutions that are more perennial and that stand on their own in terms of integration to the global economy. And for that to be achieved, obviously one of the megatrends that makes sense for us to embrace is technology. And in that particular sphere, we know we have a lot to learn from the Baltic states. You have been able to master the leapfrogging capabilities of technology, and we would like to learn more from your experience in order to take advantage of a number of opportunities that are arising, including the fact that Africa has a very young population. So it is certainly the region that is going to have the largest number of young consumers. And as we know, the more tech-intensive processes and goods are, the more appealing they are to the younger population. And taking into account the aging that is taking place in the rest of the world, this should be seen as an opportunity rather than a calamity. But for that to happen, obviously, we need to insert ourselves in a different type of narrative and a different type of discussion. What we have had so far in terms of relations with the European Union has created a sense of frustration. I would say both sides, and without wanting to throw the baby with the bathwater, because there are a number of achievements that have been possible thanks to development assistance, thanks to exchanges of all kinds, and also the philanthropy movement that exists in most of the European societies, we have to admit that structurally things have not changed. And they have not changed because the rules of trade continue to be asymmetric. They're not changed because the intellectual property continues to be skewed. They have not changed because access to finance is extremely limited for African countries. They have not changed because there is a stigma associated with the risk premium that is attributed to African countries, very different from what is practiced for the same type of indicators in other parts of the world. And all these different elements point in the direction of systemic problems that cannot be solved just with a pinch of not salt, but aid. In this case, the global gateway seems to be not an empty promise, but something that responds more to the geopolitical imperative of Europe to compete with China. But when we know that the China rise in Africa is actually only a symptom of others retrieving from past investments what they can and not investing more, rather than actually being a significant increase from the China side. China invests in Africa about $10 billion a year, which is very, very limited amount. It's more or less what they do for a country like Pakistan. Europe has the largest stock of investments in Africa, but it's eroding its position very fast because it's completely in dissync or completely away from the needs for structural transformation. So you don't see most of that investment going into industrialization. You see the presence of others in the infrastructure more than Europe. And all these elements have to change. And I think the Baltic states can play a role because they can put forward their own experience. They can demonstrate that we can do it differently. And they don't have any legacy that is going to create any difficulties for them to be sort of the primus inter pares in the discussions that are needed for us to be more frank, more direct, more candid, and not hide on bureaucratic systems, and particularly with diplomatic and other types of negotiations that basically are producing a lot of promises, a lot of proclamations, but very little change. And that is felt very immensely in the African streets, as we have seen during the pandemic, and we are seeing now with the consequences of the war in Ukraine that has immense impacts in the socioeconomic well-being of the Africans. So for all these reasons, I think this conference is very timely. It's going to create opportunities for more dialogue. We, in Africa, really welcome the opportunity to engage more with countries that are not at the forefront of the relations between Europe and Africa, but probably for that reason, they have more to say that is of interest to us, because it's a different voice and it's a different take, it's a different angle, and I think we need that mix and we need that openness that is going to create the right conditions for us to pursue what should be a meaningful dialogue, because the two continents not only are linked geographically, historically, but they are more importantly linked for the future of the world, because together they can really be the drivers of the various transitions that we have to go through, including in particular the climate transition and all its consequences. So I wish the best for this conference, and I only regret that I cannot be personally participating in the debates. Good luck.
I would say thank you for Professor, but he cannot hear us. That was a pre-recorded speech, and he was very generous to give us some of his time. So we do have a couple of minutes, since one of our keynotes was not able to join us. Perhaps I can open the floor for a couple of questions for the colleagues from Estonia and Latvia. If you want, you could join me here on the chairs, and there is a question which I'm very happy.
Hello.
If you could present yourself, that would be easier.
Sure. My name is Vince Chadwick. I'm a journalist with DevX in Brussels. One of the lesser focused on aspects of the Global Gateway communication, as far as I've seen, is the idea of a European export credit agency. Is that a good idea or not?
For Estonia, it's very much focused on the services side. I mean, we don't have a massive production of anything specific that would be making massive exports to Africa. So the side that we're really focusing on for us at the moment is the technology side. So making the connections for us at the moment is more important than the big numbers. But I think while the African continent develops, then we'll have these opportunities to look at what we do is normally the sort of high-tech added value. So, for example, we have one company that's one of the leading kitchen ventilation technologies. So, I mean, that's something that we can look in terms of a long term. But at the moment, I mean, we don't have big exports of items that would need that support at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I think I will go along the same lines. We would probably, in terms of the global gateway, focus on areas of our expertise, what we have. It will be digital, IT solutions, as I said also in my introductory remarks, banking solutions, ID cards, biometric cards, solutions, I think, and then adding and working with the larger companies to complement the bigger effort. Thank you.
You want to ask a follow-up question?
Yes, selfishly, but I want to ask someone else to have a go as well, perhaps as well.
Are there other questions at this moment? Perhaps you can go ahead and...
Sorry to hog the microphone. I did a story a few weeks ago about Lithuania wanting to join the OECD DAC committee as a member of the Rich Donors Club, as they call them in Paris, who decided what counts as aid or not. And one of the comments that came back was, well, we've got all this experience in transitioning to democracy, you know. And then some of the response was, well, maybe we shouldn't only be known for this. And maybe the experience of the Baltic states is actually vastly different from the transition that needs to happen in African countries. How do you see that debate, and whether exactly the currency of the Baltics in Africa is a clean slate, right? We can do anything. And so perhaps it's actually better to not be known as the good governance guys, but actually just, as you say, choose two countries, two issues, women and girls, and really go in that direction rather than be pigeonholed as the transition people when it comes to aid.
Excellent question. I think it's not only directed to Lithuania, but more on the principle and values.
Yes, I agree. I agree that we focus on areas where we have the expertise, since Latvia is now just entering the African market, and also in terms of development cooperation. I think we make the baby steps. We do it bit by bit, you know. So I think, yes, if we can plug in to a bigger project and contribute there, but I think it's more wise, and it's very wisely to really start by focusing on those IT, digital, as you said. You know, we start with a project with the women and girls in Zambia and Namibia, I think, which is a good impetus, and then we broaden our effort to the continent. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. We're actually also applying for the DAC, I think the meeting already took place, so hoping some positive feedback from that soon. But I think that, yes, we're in that transition topic, but the transition topic is so much wider. Take an example. When we joined the European Union, we decided immediately that we're not going to put any sort of over the period to before we start accepting the full free market. We went completely open. Some of our larger neighbors who also joined at the same time, they had a 5-year, 4-year period before they opened up the market. So maybe these types of things that we can explain, you know, the free market will operate in some ways. So maybe some countries in Africa, even if they close their market or try to protect their market, they might not win as much. So this is still a transition, but it's very much an economics type of question. So I mean, I think these will still apply. I think the other direction that we're going in is that we want to work with African countries together. We know that we cannot go there by ourselves. So we either have to work with European companies, or we have to work with African companies. And I think that is where we have something to give again to how to build up your own sector, for example, like we did in our IT sector. I think that's that's not really the sort of transition that we consider of going, you know, all of the reforms and all of the legal basis and so on and so forth, but it's really how you can be successful in building up your own economy at the same time.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience right now? Well, then I do have a question, if I may. I wanted to ask, what is going to be Latvia's agenda in the Security Council with regards to Africa?
I think we will focus on good governance. We will focus on rules-based order, international rules-based order, rule of law, and democracy. I think it is very fundamental in these times, especially. I think the role of small states, small countries, inviolability of borders, integrity of borders, of territorial integrity. I think those issues are paramount, and being a small member state, potentially when we get elected to the United Nations Security Council, I think we will advance those issues very prominently. Also, human rights, very, very high on our agenda. Thank you.
Can I comment as well? I actually was on our UN Security Council campaign team, and I was responsible for Africa. So I think our best message there was that our door is always open and that we're coming here to listen to you. And I think that was one of the things that worked out really well for us. That as was mentioned here, I think on one of the quotes that you know, the Europeans come and they always come and teach us. Well, we said, no, our door is open. We want to hear. We're not experts in Africa. Come and tell us what are the challenges. And throughout our time in the UN Security Council, our door was always open to African nations. So a little suggestion.
Yeah, indeed. And I think we have very, very, very rightly, and we are already reaching out, and this is also during all the debates now in New York on the various resolutions, and we are doing our best actually to listen to African partners also during our outreach efforts. And of course, I mean, for any resolution there is lots of commotion, lots of discussions going behind the closed doors as well. So these informal consultations provide invaluable input also to our efforts, and I think it is really very important to listen to our African partners, but also I think we can contribute, given our experience as small states, having been occupied in the past by the same aggressor, which is now threatening a bigger state, and also is a danger and a threat to European security and global security. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question. Great. The microphone over here. Over here. Yes.
Hi, I'm Andrea Schmidt. I'm Niger desk at the EAS. I'm listening mostly with great interest, and I can only encourage more diversity of voices in Africa. I've heard the Professor Lopez, of course, he was talking about structural change that is needed, including for investment, which you are particularly interested in. But I would assume that the Baltic states have too little leverage to for that kinds of discussions. So how are you bringing your voice in on the European side, I wonder, in the Council with well, in a larger Europe that does have the leverage, on the other hand, for those kinds of structural changes. Also to bring in your priorities on democracy, human rights, and so on. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. I think that we don't have to underestimate ourselves, because when we went with our president, Kersti Kaljulaid, to the AU summit, we organized together with Paul Kagame a roundtable with the heads of state talking about the digital revolution. And for us in Estonia, digitalization was an equalizer. it doesn't discriminate against anyone. So those who cannot leave their home, for example, for religious or for family reasons, they have access to education through digitalization. They have access to running a business through digitalization. It doesn't discriminate against the old or the young. And also the trick that we always talk, it also brings transparency. So our President Ilves always used to say that you cannot bribe a computer. So I think in this type of looking at systems that worked for us will also help Africa in these areas. They have to understand if digitalization, which is something good for them, will also open this door to transparency and to good governance. So I think these are still some ways that we can still share our experiences and still change things in Africa. And of course, we're at the EU table here. I mean, we're a full member, and we're always pushing these types of topics, and we're trying our best to be at the table and to be a good voice.
Yeah, thank you. I can also add that indeed, yes, we are small, but when we work together, the impact is huge and it is more visible. So the Baltics, also very many other like-minded countries, when we work with the EU and take those decisions, I think they are very impactful. Also, another issue which we will also focus during our upcoming Security Council presidency will, of course, be climate change. So it's also digitalization, those issues which have also been mentioned here. So working closer together, also engaging the smaller African countries on the issues, listening to them carefully, and sharing our experience in the past is something to reckon with.
Thank you. I want to pick up on something that you said, and after my question, we'll have a break. You mentioned that the Baltic states or Estonia are really trying to be heard, be at the table. So I wanted to ask, what do you see as obstacles within different EU formats for the Baltic states to be heard more, be considered, be involved, if there are any?
I don't know. I think we just need to work, and I think we are used as diplomats here in Brussels. The more time you spend here, the more you understand that that talking, working in smaller groups, bigger groups, it works, it helps, and engaging the institutions, the Commission, the External Action Service, reaching out to the Parliament, formal, informal meetings. I wouldn't complain that we are not heard. I think we just need to maintain the level of activity. Also now, especially during this time when Russia is waging a war, I think we are among those who are pushing very hard to have a hard stance, and I believe it works. In the institution, with the institutions, at 27. Also, when our politicians and diplomats speak out publicly, it works. So I think, yes, there are probably some downsides, and we wish to be probably more up to speed, quicker. But I think, as I said, when we take those decisions at 27, or at NATO, for that matter, they are so powerful, and so they complement the many efforts we are taking elsewhere in other fora, in the UN, also in NATO, I think with like-minded countries, with the G7. So all this is interconnected, So we also follow very, very closely what is happening with the G7, for instance. We are sharing our ideas with the partners, and we are listening and hearing the feedback from those discussions, formal, informal. I think having been a member in the EU for so many years already, we have learned the tricks of how to operate in this very complicated environment, I have to say. I agree, it is a very complicated environment, and you need time to learn the ropes.
Thank you. I think the biggest obstacle is people, the resource. There are so many working groups. There are so many things that we need to cover here in Brussels, especially. And of course, as everyone's mentioned, that the topic is coming up. The Russian aggression in Ukraine has again put a very large strain on our resources. But I think that if you really are interested in participating, all the possibilities are here in Brussels. There's nothing to hold you back. But definitely, you have to show interest in all of the topics. So I think that this argument that we're having the challenge in Africa regarding the Russian war in Ukraine is the feedback, well, why weren't you interested in our topics? So again, you need the resources, you need the people to be able to cover, also the political will to follow what's happening in the continent. And then when you're at the table, you're taken seriously. So again, for us, it was really the fact that we went with our president to several countries really opened the eyes and showed that we were serious. So the president, the stamp of approval is taken very seriously in Africa and very much appreciated. So they really appreciate you coming to see them, and that again opens the door to have influence also in Brussels, because you know those people. If you have a direct contact to them, and especially in times of where we are right now, these direct contacts are of utmost importance.
Thank you, and I hope we are creating more opportunities to cooperate between the Baltic states and pool our resources together so that we can solve the challenge of limited human capacities that all three countries share. We'll go into a break right now, and we'll start again at 10:30 with a discussion specifically on how the war in Ukraine is disrupting the EU-Africa relations and what Baltic have to say about it. Just before we go, I want to thank Africa-Europe Foundation and Friends of Europe for being our partners in this event. And I also want to thank Virunga Blue Mountains that are supplying us with a delicious coffee that I hope every one of you will enjoy during this break. So let's chat and have some good coffee right now. Thank you.
Sound check? Okay, yeah, it works. we can start entering the room so we can start our panel. Yes, 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 feel free. There is one panelist missing, Mr. Tereshko, and then we can start. Okay, I think we can start. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you today to discuss these topics with a very distinguished panel of experts, practitioners, and representatives from also different member states. So it's an honor for me. We have, unfortunately, for bureaucratic issues, one panelist missing, but we are glad that he could join virtually today. My name is Daniele Fattibene. I'm the coordinator of the European Think Tanks Group, ETTG. We are a network of 6 think tanks in Europe from different member states, Germany, France, UK, Italy, Belgium/Netherlands, and Spain. We are gathering more than 400 researchers dealing with Africa and development cooperation in Europe, independent think tanks. And we're very glad to be with you today, representing the network, and also hearing new voices in the Europe-Africa dialogue that we know it's very much influenced by traditional voices, so it's good that the experience of the Baltics are taken into account when we discuss about these topics, because in these very contested times, they can be, very significantly driving the debate, both internally within the EU and externally with our partners. Let me first introduce our panelists today. I will start with Ambassador Arnoldas Prankevicius, Ambassador of Lithuania to the EU. It will be leaving shortly because he has some meetings today, but we have also a new panelist who will replace him. We're also glad for you that you took the time for being with us today. We have Mr. Serhii Tereshko, Deputy Head of the Mission of Ukraine to the European Union. Mr. Nicola Bellomo, Head of Division of Pan-African Affairs in the European External Action Service. Dr. Hassan Kanenye, who is joining virtually, and he is Director of the Horn International Institute for Strategic Studies. And last but not least, Dr. Patrick Labuda, who is a Fellow from the University of Zurich. So let me start by giving the floor to all our panelists, and I will start with Ambassador Prankevicius. We discussed this before, and I think this is something we should elaborate more now, that the Baltic states are a very good example of democratic transition in the European Union. Lithuania is one of the most important examples of this, and it can serve as a democracy hub also for African countries. So what is your opinion about the role that Lithuania and the Baltic states can play in helping and in creating a dialogue with African countries in, building this transition towards democracy in a context in which the Russian aggression of Ukraine is, putting a challenge to democratic values, not only within the EU, but also externally. So I will give you the floor. We'll just remind you the rules of the game. We have 5-7 minutes each to reply to the questions. I will try to be as strict as possible, but the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniele, and great pleasure to be at this very, indeed, important conference and to be with you this morning. Your question, I think, is a very interesting one, because indeed for us as the Baltic states, relationship with African countries is something which I would say is still untapped potential. We are very much trying to expand our diplomatic and economic presence in the continent and find the ways where we can cooperate. And here also, for instance, I would like to mention Africo, you know, one of the NGOs which is organizing this conference, and its flagship program, Digital Explorers, you know, bringing the ICT specialists specifically from Nigeria, but probably not only, to Lithuania for, you know, to the IT companies for training, professional experience, and building those relationships also in the high technology field, which is a very good example that, you know, we shouldn't be in this relationship of only giving and taking or recipient and donor, but rather an equal type of relationship where we can learn from each other. And here I think the Baltic states, as you've mentioned, have an interesting story to tell, a story of freedom, a story of successful transformation, a story of course of oppression, of multiple occupations, you know, from Tsarist to Nazi to Soviet, and a story of people who have resisted those occupations and the totalitarian regimes. And the only 3 former Soviet Union republics that have made the whole journey, the full journey, to the fully fledged democratic systems and free market economies and full members of the European Union and NATO. By itself, you know, sometimes also in Lithuania, we treat it today as a miracle, and we're very grateful to also to fate and to the big determination of our previous governments and the populations and of the European Union to have made it a success. But now, today, we have a historical obligation vis-à-vis the people of Ukraine, specifically to help them in their quest, not only for freedom, but I would say for survival, when they are attacked so fundamentally by Russia, which has invaded the country and has undermined the critical and most important principles of the United Nations Charter of territorial integrity and sovereignty, and that is committing every day the war crimes and undermining the international law and international conventions. So I think in this situation, we have an opportunity, not only a challenge, but a great opportunity to find common ground with our partners in Africa, to be much more convincing also in our strategic communication. And of course, I'm sure my colleague from the ES will be talking about that, because High Representative Vice President Borrell is often discussing the problem of the battle of narratives and the place which European Union is playing in that regard. We should be very open about the facts, especially vis-à-vis the growing food and energy security crisis, where we saw also it playing out very vividly last week in the United Nations General Assembly, where many leaders addressed that question, and where quite clearly also the Western leaders were showing the data and the examples how with our common efforts we've been helping to alleviate those problems through the solidarity lanes, through the, you know, of course, the agreement with Ukraine, mediated also by the United Nations and Turkey, to get the grain out of the Odessa port and other Ukrainian ports to the world. And 2/3 of that grain is going to, in fact, the less developed countries. So this is an opportunity for us to be together, especially in defense of human rights, in defense of democracy, in defense of fundamental, in many ways, principles of human dignity and sovereign choices of countries to exist. This is fundamental. It's not about the choice between the West or the East, between the South or the North. It is the choice between, you know, respecting international law, respecting United Nations Charter or not. And I think there, I'm quite confident we all have the answer on both continents where we stand, and that this type of behavior, which we've seen and we're seeing every single day in Ukraine, is unacceptable and can be very dangerous for any country in the future if this world of international law and norms and rules is broken into such a fundamental way. So I think, you know, we as the Baltic states, we have a small story, but a convincing story to tell, and we're very much ready to play a very active role in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and I agree that you do have a convincing story to tell, and in a context where the mutual trust between Europe and Africa is under challenge, especially from the African side for ambitions that maybe were not met or promises which were not kept. These concrete examples are important for them. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Tereshko. We know that in the past weeks, President Zelensky has also started to engage with several African partners to create a dialogue and a platform to discuss also for the restoration of the country. What do you think could be the role of the European Union and also Central East European countries? What role could they play in this dialogue between Ukraine and African leaders to discuss short-term but also medium and long-term perspectives of cooperation?
Good morning. First of all, thank you for having me here. My apologies that Ambassador couldn't make it being here, and the reason, in fact, very much related to the issue of today's discussion. Today there is a Agrifish EU Council meeting, and our Ukrainian Minister for Agriculture and Food is here in Brussels to participate in this EU Council meeting, probably to a significant extent to discuss the global food crisis and Ukraine's and EU joint efforts in this regard, how to solve this problem, which affects Africa probably the most. Later on, there will be also today a Transport Committee meeting of the European Parliament, again with participation of Ukrainian Ministry of Infrastructure, discussing the ways how efficient or not the solidarity lanes and grain initiatives are operating. And this is just two examples of today to show to which extent food crisis and Africa aspect influences, in fact, Ukraine-EU agenda as well. And yes, you're perfectly right mentioning that Ukrainian leadership, starting from the President of Ukraine and in fact continuing with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is increasing the attention to the Africa. I can disclose you the nearest plan of our Minister for Foreign Affairs that he is planning probably the first 4 decades tourney to Africa in coming weeks, I believe, or days, visiting probably the countries which Ukrainian high authorities never visited before. So it will be physical visit for extensive number of countries. So, and the reason here probably indeed that any existential crisis, as Ambassador Prinskevicius described, is also an opportunity to think what we didn't not proper enough before, and in this context, I believe it can be referred both to the EU probably and to Ukraine for sure, that we didn't pay necessary attention to the African cause, and we are going to resolve this issue very actively. President of Ukraine has reached out number of African leaders. He spoke to African Union and conveying the messages, what are the reasons of the current crisis in the world, and in fact we are facing, we in response we understand that there is an understanding What we lacked, probably the lack of communication. We had to talk more to Africa, and here I believe we have to combine our efforts with the European Union in arranging these lines of good communication, because, well, results are the current situation, for instance, in the UN is quite unfortunately to us outspoken, that many African countries still follow the Russian ratio about the reasons of the crisis, and even their voting outcomes shows that to a significant extent they are either abstaining or not voting, even with some example of voicey voting in favor of Russia. So we really wish to solve this miscommunication, or lack of communication, better to say, between Africa and Europe, being part of Europe in most effective way. And your precise question, how particularly Ukraine or Africa or Central Eastern Europe can be helpful, probably also it should be a lesson for us that it happens so that African policy of the EU, sorry that I'm assessing the EU African policy, but was led mostly not by Central Eastern Europe but some other member states having greater experience in Africa relations. So probably we have to bring fresh air, fresh attitude, fresh approach to this communication between Europe, and I'm specifically calling Europe, not EU, having Ukraine in mind as well, in arranging these lines of communication with Africa. We are ready as Ukraine to provide our experience as well, and as Ukraine in fact had good experience in providing experts to Africa in exploration, African economies, African resources, working there on the ground. So we have good specialists knowing some particular countries with their potential economic capabilities. Ukraine has excellent experience and knowledge in teaching students from Africa. We have enormous amount of students which wish to study from Africa, to study in Ukraine, and in fact many of them were faced the war of Russia in Ukraine personally. Their work has come when they were in Ukraine, so their studying has interrupted, but we hope that it will be resumed, and we also ready to suggest to the European Union our experience and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tereshko. And I think this issue of the cultural links and the education is fundamental, and not stopping these flows is extremely important, because it creates this informal dialogue and also exchange of younger generations on topics, and maybe it can also influence political decisions. I will now turn to Mr. Bellomo. We know that the Russian aggression occurred 1 week after the EU summit, long-awaited summit with a lot of expectations from both sides, and also a lot of frustrations for the delay. And we know that during the summit there were a lot of ambitious targets proposed by both sides. And in the meantime, the US launched very ambitious plans like the Global Gateway, and the war in Ukraine occurred in a moment where it seemed that this trust was starting to a little bit recovering, and then it changed the plans. So my question to you is, how is the Russian aggression to Ukraine changing the topics, the priorities on which the European External Action Service is working on Africa? And do you see a change in this policy agenda, and how you try to combine the traditional plans that you had with the new geopolitical and geoeconomic context in which you are operating?
Thank you very much, and allow me at the very outset to thank Africo, Friends of Europe, and the Africa-Europe Foundation for hosting this event. which provides a good opportunity to exchange and discuss on these very topical issues, and allow me also to frame this discussion in what is, without any ambiguity, the European Union considers this an illegal, unjustified aggression. And as Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, mentioned only a few days ago in the State of the Union address, we do consider this aggression not only aggression to Ukraine, but an aggression, as the ambassador mentioned, to our economy, to our values, and to our future. And in this respect, there is also no ambiguity that support to Ukraine is part of this broader solution. And again, the European Union is fully committed to support Ukraine in this framework. So some observers and the UN Secretary General mentioned we are in kind of a perfect storm, which is a combination of different crises, some of them not necessarily started with the aggression of Russia to Ukraine, like food security, which was mentioned. Food security is emerging as probably the most critical aspect of this crisis when it comes to Africa and the impact on African economies and the impact on the development path of African countries. So when you ask me to what extent these crises will impact, I can tell you that we can hardly see our relations with Africa only through the lenses of the Russian aggression. This Russian aggression has had an impact on the global landscape, not only on the Europe-Africa relation. So we have to frame these into the broader context and address this. And I can tell you that when it comes to the food security, for instance, and this also allows me, and I regret, I have a lot of respect for Professor Carlos Lopez. I witness his, let's say, strong commitment in my last 20 years I spent in Africa. I'm new, I moved to Brussels only 2 weeks ago. So this being said, I can hardly understand diminishing or let's say downgrading Global Gateway, for instance, to something which is there just to a label to match or to mirror what Chinese are doing. Here we're talking about a very ambitious development plan. And again, what I can hardly understand is this persistent and dominant narrative about a European Union patronizing or pointing fingers, which I can tell you in my experience on the ground over the last 20 years, it's an issue of the past. I mean, what's happening these days and what's it shaping our EU-Africa relation is based really on a very integrated approach. We build our priorities and we align our priorities 100% with the local development agendas, priorities, and plans. So we try to support the vision and the ambitions of our partner countries at bilateral, regional, and continental level. So I really would challenge anyone to give me an example, not just in theory, but an example where these projected European Union patronizing approach is taking place these days, because I can hardly mention any. So to go back to our relations, as I mentioned, especially as a result of the summit in February, we are shaping a very ambitious agenda and very much focused on tangible, operational, and transformational objectives. So again, when it comes to food security, our main objectives these days in Africa, and again, both at bilateral and regional continental level, is to support our partner countries in transforming their agriculture sector. So to move away from traditional subsistence agriculture to a more market-oriented, export-oriented introduction of high-value crops, so introduction of new technologies, so a lot of transfer of capacity, etc. So this is also very much important to be framed within the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which was mentioned earlier this morning, which in my opinion can be a real game changer when it comes to the both intra-African trade, but also in relation to our relation with the European Union, between European Union and Africa. And I really welcome this renewed engagement for the Baltic countries, because I think, I mean, European Union is really can be a model of integration. So when it comes to the implementation of an internal market, when it comes to promotion of values, I think that we all, and regardless of the size of the country, we have our voice. The fact that you don't have probably your flag linked to specific activities does not mean you are not present. I mean, I was very proudly representing the European Union in different countries. My last one was in Rwanda until a couple of weeks ago, where I was proudly representing the whole European Union, and not only the few countries, very few that have an embassy in Rwanda. So I think we should also move away from this notion and also try to promote a better integration in what we call the Team Europe approach. Team Europe is becoming really is not just a buzzword, it's really a reality on the ground, where we try to maximize and produce cross-fertilization among what we as European Union can do, our member states, our financial institutions, namely the European Investment Bank, and also to take on board the private sector. This is also what is worth, I think, mentioning in terms of a new feature of this Africa-EU partnership. And that's where I think we all have a role to play. So I also witnessed myself a number of companies from Baltic countries exploring, scouting, and coming to also mapping. As the ambassador mentioned, I think it's very important to map these opportunities, because we are still, and especially these days with this Russian crisis, these perceptions can really shape, you know, a different understanding of the opportunities between Europe and Africa. So I think it's very important to debunk, and later I think we will discuss about these battles of narratives. So I will wait, but I think this is a clear element. As Ambassador mentioned, the High Representative Josep Borrell is really emphasizing this element, but I think we'll come back later to this point. Thank you.
No, but thanks a lot for mentioning this issue of the narratives and perceptions, because this is actually what I wanted to ask now to Mr. Kanenia. We know, you remember very well, and we all remember very well, end of February when the voting at UN General Assembly took place, that Europeans were shocked when they saw that there was not a common perception and common agreement on the aggression of Russia, of Ukraine. So my question is, I'm coming back very recently from Zimbabwe and Botswana, and even there you see that the debate that we have in Europe is very much different, of course, in countries which have been hit very hard from COVID and they're still recovering, and now are hit by you know, the consequences of the war in Ukraine for food security, debt. So my question to you is, what is the perception of what is going on in Ukraine, in Africa, in your country, and how do you think we Europeans should even change our narratives when we come into dialogue with African countries on these particular topics? You are muted, I think.
Yes, you can hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, thank you very much, and you know, for organizers for putting this together. I think it's a timely discussion. Was unable to travel to Brussels, but hopefully next time I should be able to make it in case we have such an event. Yeah, now, question is actually very good. Now, while especially our Western and European partners were shocked at Africa's reaction, on the other hand, Africans were shocked, but actually our European and Western partners were shocked at Africa's reaction. And the reason, you know, comes from a number of things. When you, the Kenya's ambassador to the United Nations gave a very eloquent, you know, take and a speech that, of course, that castigated Russia's actions in Ukraine, alluding to a number of historical as well as practical things with regard to international law that, of course, you know, Russia had violated. However, if you listen to the last part of his speech, and Ambassador Kimani is a man I know, he's a good friend of mine, he mentioned a number of aspects that actually explains in large part Africa's ambivalent, especially towards the conflict. And that is, he mentioned the recent the trend in the recent past of the big powers breaching international law, and he mentioned the trend in the recent past of the big powers, and he mentioned specifically that including members of the Security Council violating territorial integrity, but pretty much getting what they want and disobeying, or at least in total disregard to multilateralism, which of course was trying to front. And so the last part of his speech was actually more explanatory when it comes to Africa's attitudes towards the conflict. Now, how do Africans see this? I would like slightly to disagree with the last speaker on the concept that there is no sense of patronizing of the continent. And I'm speaking as someone who understands this continent fairly well. Perhaps it's not exactly towards Europe, but generally towards the West, especially insofar as dealing with Africa is concerned. And if you're paying special attention recently, a South Africa's minister for foreign affairs, the kind of speech and remarks she made during the visit by the United States Secretary of State Blinken, I think it encapsulates a lot of thinking on the African continent from Cairo to the Cape of Good Hope. That is across the continent. And this thing, of course, is informed by a number of dynamics that have taken place in the recent past. And that has to do with the sense, number one, that Africa lacks agency when it comes to global geopolitics or things that matter. Second, that whenever it comes to a crisis outside the continent, especially in Europe, Africa is completely forgotten. And Africans have been pointing to a number of crises that are going on the continent right now, not just in food security, but the continent, the crisis in Ethiopia, the conflict and terrorism, in the Sahel region, the instabilities in the DRC, going all the way down, of course, to Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, as important conflicts and issues that perhaps the world should have paid attention to that it's not paying attention to right now. And so this one compounded with the fact that in the Cold War era, one thing that happened that was fundamental, especially in the African psyche, is that as the West, especially the richer powers in the West, focused more on reconstructing Eastern Europe, Africa was all but abandoned. And that sense, it is actually deep inside. Now, these are not issues or ideas that are shared generally in polite company. And that is why perhaps sometimes our colleague might not have exactly been able to get it from some scholars or politicians on the continent. But it's something, if you are to organize a town hall of university graduates or even people just on the streets, they're going to be able to communicate the truth. And that is what informs this kind of challenge. Now, without perhaps going too much into details, how do they see the conflict right now? The conflict is seen as from a geopolitical standpoint. Number one, as an unresolved Cold War, issue between especially NATO and what remained of Soviet Union, which is now Russia, or at least a big part of this, what was Soviet Union, which is Russia. And it's seen from the prism of contestations between the East and the West, generally, in part also because of what has been happening on the continent. One thing that the continent has witnessed is the West re-engagement on the continent has been more in response, for instance, to Chinese and Russia's actions, as opposed to inherent long-term policy calculations and calibrations that are actually going to strengthen the kind of engagement that is needed. Now, for those of us, for instance, who believe in more free societies, more open societies, and more democratic societies, we are almost right now in a corner, in part because the relative success of perceived authoritarianism, but also the relative abandonment of, especially of the ideas of democracy in terms of especially robust support from the West, has led to the declining democracy on the continent. And in part because there's so much focus on other issues that the continent has become not only an afterthought, but it's actually something that's become a footnote. There is another critical aspect which I would like to bring to attention that perhaps sometimes our colleagues and partners in the West do not understand. And that, of course, then also explains to the sense of patronizing attitudes that sometimes Africans have. Africans, by and large, blame the West generally for having destroyed Libya. And the destruction of Libya, or the collapse of Libya, set into motion a series of events that destabilized the entire Sahel and much of Horn of Africa. Some of us who deal in especially security issues, we can trace a lot of things with regard to the impact of the collapse of Libya and how that has destabilized much of Africa and increased the problem of terrorism. In fact, 5 or 6 attempted coups in West Africa and the Horn, for instance, in the last 24 months, are directly attributed to the clamor for security that the governments in those countries are actually not providing as a result of the growth of terrorist and militant groups. And so these are issues that sometimes are not exactly discussed by our partners or understood. And yet, when the Libya collapsed, for instance, the West absolutely withdrew, at least that's how Africans look at it. And then they abandoned and left Africa to fend for itself. Now, that is complicated by the recent conflict in Ukraine, in which, for instance, when the sanctions were rightly and justifiably imposed on Russia for its blatant violation of international law and human rights, Africa was never consulted with the extent to which it's going to be affected or how, for instance, the world was going to plug in for that shortfall. In some countries on the continent and in the Horn, they rely as much as 40 or even 60% of their wheat imports from that conflict area. Of course, they are going to suffer immensely. Yet, this is the continent that is also suffering a lot from the effects of climate change as well as perpetual drought. The Horn of Africa and Kenya, for instance, they've seen the worst drought in 40 years. But these are issues that are not exactly addressed, nor were they ever considered. So the rise in energy prices, the rise in food prices and commodity prices and cement and as well as others is literally preventing this ability of these countries to be able to recover from the post-COVID, or rather post-act. And so a number of these factors have conspired to make the conflict in Ukraine not only remote, but as something to Africans that the West, for instance, is using to try and get the attention of the continent at the time, of course, when they need the continent. But a lot of times, whenever it comes to critical issues that affect the continent, they are normally an afterthought. And so I think we have to discuss honestly and frankly, especially for those of us who share common ideas when it comes to international law, human rights, and democracy, if we actually have to have a common approach. I think my minute is up, and so I would like to put it back to the moderator.
Thank you so much. Very important points, and the issue of the ambiguity of European partners on human rights and international law is on the table and should always be reminded, because we should never take it for granted when then we address African countries on specific topics dealing with governance, on security, etc. So I would like to turn now the floor to Dr. Patrick Labuda. The last speaker rightly mentioned the fact that there is the need for a more nuanced dialogue between Africa, Europe. What topics do you think are most relevant in this change of narratives and change of discussions that should be brought to the table, and how the experience of Central East European intellectual can play a role in this? Because we know that the transition was not only a political, economic transition, but also a cultural one. And the experience of the Baltics and the Central and East European countries is extremely relevant on this side. So how do you think your experience could bring more nuances in the dialogue between Europe and Africa on issues like international law, human rights, but also human and economic development?
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the previous intervention, because I think it sets the stage nicely for what I'm going to say. I mean, I come at this as an academic, as an intellectual, not a policymaker, not a diplomat. So I'm afraid I may be a little more long-winded in my remarks, a little less diplomatic also. I mean, thank you also for the opportunity. It's really great to be here. I am representing Eastern Europe, whatever that means. I'm not from a Baltic state. I happen to be from Poland, and I live in Senegal, so I've been observing, the evolution in Africa's response, to use, again, a very general term, Africa, what is Africa? But just observing how African states are responding to the war in Ukraine, and I want to share my thoughts, what I've observed and what I think about this as somebody who comes from Eastern Europe. The first thing to emphasize really, and this is going off what the previous panelist said, Africa's response, I think, is complex. We need to try and understand it in its complexity and its nuances. This is not a simple case of Africa responding with one voice, right? So I think it's important always to really be humble in approaching these issues. And I think, the previous speaker has given us a lot to think about already. That being said, I'm going to now turn to narratives, general narratives that emerged after this war restarted. And so I'm going to generalize a little bit, and of course, not all African states have the same view, not all Africans feel the same way, but I feel that these narratives are pretty dominant, common, not just in Africa, but also in Europe. So a common narrative, I think, is that this is a war between the West and Russia, between NATO and Russia, Europe and Russia, that this is somehow a conflict that has pitted the global North versus the global South. And what's really interesting about this, of course, is that this is the narrative that Russia has been selling, right? And it's a narrative that's become very dominant, not just in Africa, but also in Europe. When people talk about this war, oftentimes here in Europe, we also adopt these frames. And so I want to complexify this a little bit, coming from Eastern Europe, from Poland, and get us thinking about a few things to sort of maybe challenge this narrative. I mean, the first thing to say about this is that it really denies the agency of the Ukrainians in this war. And we just heard a thing or two about the agency of Africa, right? But let's be clear about this. We are denying the agency of Ukraine in this war when we talk about it as a conflict between the West and Russia, NATO and Russia. The Ukrainians have been very clear about this, right? They've said, we do not want to be colonized by Russia again, right? It's very simple. Our old colonial master is not coming back. And I think we need to pay attention to what the Ukrainians are saying. The other thing about this that I think is really interesting is that the narratives get everything completely wrong. I mean, it's literally upside down if you think about this. The reason we have this war is because Ukraine is not a part of the West. It is not a part of the European Union. If you think about it, I'm not really sure that it is a part of the global North. Just think about it. If Ukraine were a part of NATO, were a part of the European Union, would Russia have attacked? I'm really not so sure. The problem here is that Ukraine occupies, in my opinion, an ill-defined space in between. It's a post-colonial state, a weak state. If you look at the Human Development Index, it's at 77. It's below many so-called Global South countries. Go to the Human Development Index. You'll see many countries from Latin America that are above Ukraine, many countries from Asia that are above Ukraine, and that's before the war. Now that the war has, taken its toll, Ukraine is going to be well below various Global South countries. The problem here is that Ukraine is somewhere in between. It doesn't really fit. The point I'm trying to make is that we all have our mental maps about the world, Europe, East, West, NATO, Russia, the global North, global South, but Ukraine, it doesn't really map on to these maps very well. I mean, if you think about it a little harder, Ukraine occupies a really ill-defined space. Now, the question that I ask myself, if you accept what I'm saying, because of course, you can challenge whether this is an accurate portrayal, but the question that I ask myself is, why do these narratives hold? Why can't we complexify the conversation? Why are we not having a more complex debate about Ukraine and this war, right? And you know, here, I guess the point that I'm going to make, and this is a point that's directed not just at Africa, it's directed at Europe. You know, we need to take more seriously the voices of Eastern Europeans, so people from the region, Ukrainians in particular, but people from the region who have experienced Russian imperialism, Russian colonialism. And, you know, it's really interesting that when you hear people talking about this war, oftentimes the experts are from Western Europe. And that goes for the European External Action Service, right, where I used to work for a few years. You know, the people who actually go and engage with Africans trying to explain this conflict, where are they from? From Italy, Germany, France? They're all from Western Europe, people who don't really have legitimacy to talk about colonialism, imperialism in Africa. And I think it's a missed opportunity. The European Union needs to do a better job of integrating Eastern Europeans. You know, my country, Poland, I know that it's not really contributing to the European project right now. So we can be self-critical about this, right? But I think the European Union can also be more critical about it, about its policies. In Africa, same thing. It's really interesting because, you know, I follow Al Jazeera, Africa News. I watch that more than I do CNN. When Ukrainians feature on the news, it's in the role of the victim. It's the victim, the emotional victim who, you know, the war is affecting us. But when you have experts, you have local experts from the Middle East, from Africa, which is great. But then when you have a foreign expert, they happen to be from Western Europe, the United States, the United Kingdom. Very rarely do you have people from the Baltics, from Eastern Europe, from Ukraine. Again, in my opinion, a missed opportunity. And it is, of course, ironic that this would happen on Al Jazeera, where, you know, Africans oftentimes complain about the lack of agency, the fact that African positions are not taken seriously. I'm not sure that Ukrainian positions are being taken very seriously always in these conversations either. In conclusion, why do I think all this matters? Just very briefly, because I know I've already exceeded my time. But you know, I don't think this is a question of just us being inclusive for the sake of us being inclusive, right? Representation for the sake of representation. It's not just about having people from the region speak about these issues because you know, it's important to include local voices, although that is very important. I think it's also that this would really nuance the debate, you know, and I'll just say one word about the prohibition on the use of force. I'm an international lawyer, so I come at this from that angle. I think to generate understanding, greater understanding about what is at stake when it comes to the violation of the prohibition of the use of force, Article 2.4 in the UN Charter, the fact that we do not want to return to the 19th century. We do not want territorial conquest. That is not a world that we want to live in. And I think, you know, if we have these conversations that are more inclusive, that include the views of people who until very recently lived under Russian occupation, I think that would generate greater understanding of what is at stake in this war. We do not want to return to the 19th century where the great powers partitioned Africa, where the great powers partitioned Eastern Europe, right? So I think a lot is at stake here, and you know, I guess just ending this, I would say that it is a plea for more dialogue between Europe and Africa. But when I say Europe, I don't just mean Western Europe, I do mean Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, and of course, Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I subscribe 100% to this, and I think this lack of expertise in the key institutions that are dealing with this particular topic is also the consequence of disinvestment towards this area and this neighborhood that has taken place in the past years. Probably we took it for granted that nothing bad could happen in that part of Europe for forever. So this led to a disengagement and disinvestments in the human capital needed to analyze and assess what's going on there with the proper people and minds. I will now turn the floor for a quick second round of questions to Mr. Saulius Jaskelevicius. I hope I pronounced it correctly, Counselor at the Lithuanian Permanent Representation to the EU and Delegate of the COAFRE Working Group. I wanted to ask you, what is in the meetings you attend and in the working groups you are active, what are the topics that you, as a representative of a Baltic country, bring to the table to make the Europe-Africa relation and cooperation more tangible, more concrete? I heard this and I love this expression from the first panel that digitalization is an equalizer. How do you bring your successful experience on digital transition in the decision processes and in these key tables to the discussion with your European counterparts? He needs the mic, yes.
Thank you very much. One more time, apologies on behalf of our ambassador. He has left so suddenly because we have this urgent meeting on the Russian mobilization. It seems the conflict going on the escalation way, and now they knew they're thinking how to respond to this new round of escalation we see. Thank you very much for this event. Really, I think it's a very important topic that we are discussing it today. It's of course it's number one question, I would say, in all European couloirs now. We are at war. Who may think, I would say, until 24th of February that we may sit here just half a year from the February and now speak about the war in Europe in our days. Not about development, not about progress, green technologies, fintech or digitalization. Or we're speaking about war. It's not the question of how do Africans perceive this, or how do Europeans or NATO or Russians, you know. The main thing is that we're skipping the future. Really, we're losing the future, not only for Europeans, for Africans. We're losing the future for our children, what kind of world we're going to live for them. I think this is matters. Really, it's not the question of pain of Ukrainian people who are suffering very much now in these days, but this is the question of future of all international system. And maybe you have heard now on these days in New York, very fresh discussions how to reform the United Nations system, because the United Nations system was exactly created to avoid such things after World War II, and now we are at war, and all the international system we known until now it's slowly, but it's collapsing. And as the honorable speaker said from Africa, you know, really the voice of Africans, the voice of Eastern Europeans, the voice of other countries, emerging countries, developing countries, we should be heard. It's not about the conflict between the West and the East. It's about to be heard. I very much associated with this. And from my point of view, because I am more dealing with practical things, I would say that it's question of opportunities. Of opportunities that we can find ourselves in relation to Africa. We're speaking about losses, but it's also a question of opportunities. You see, for instance, the energy markets. Yes, we now can see the rapprochement between Europe and the African continent, because the African continent is crucial, absolutely crucial in energy terms. On other side, the Europeans can provide Africa with their technologies, with their help. We're coming to the digital era. Absolutely, our country is focused on that. We are working on digitalization, on green energy, green transformation, and everything. We are mutually dependent. And if I understand that there is a mutual dependence between Europe and Africa, and we cannot change the geopolitics. We are in the same ship, sitting, and we cannot change our neighborhood, our mutual dependence. So we can find the ways forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tereshko. We know that the reconstruction and restoration of peace, of dignity, of economic development, or human development in Ukraine will take time, and the whole international community will have to play a big role in that. How do you see African, not only countries in terms of, policymakers, but also the private sector, the CSOs, play a role in this? A lot of African countries are dealing with fragility, reconstruction. A lot of them came out of big civil wars. How do you think, and also do you could facilitate this dialogue in a perspective of reconstructing the country? What do you think this role could be from the African counterparts?
Yes, good question. Of course, the Ukraine is thinking very attentively about the future reconstruction, despite war is still ongoing. We already have to plan our efforts, and indeed, we will only welcome any contributions, any efforts that any global partner of Ukraine may suggest, including African one. Why not? And it is clear that only EU efforts of reconstruction will be not sufficient, given the scope of the destruction in Ukraine, and global consolidated efforts in this regard is needed. However, at the same time, we also understand that Africa itself still needs support, and as it was already mentioned, Africa was not able to recover from COVID crisis when the new heat of crisis related to the Russian war against Ukraine hit the continent as well. So in this regard, I would rather see the perspective of restoring, reestablishing, and development of what good which Ukraine and Africa used to have and still have, meaning sustainable and extensive economic relations. So which I believe should be mutually beneficial, both for Ukrainian businesses, Ukrainian companies participating in infrastructure projects in Africa. There were many mentioning of digitalization. Ukraine, for a couple of last years, performed itself one of the well, success stories of digitalization in Europe, and with already significant expertise even for the EU level, we can suggest many solutions, and we can transfer these ideas also to Africa, which it was mentioned in the first panel that that digitalization will contribute to fighting corruption, which is also what the case for Ukraine and still is, frankly, and which is definitely is the case for Africa. So we believe that our immediate potential of mutual interest is reestablishing of normal relations, reestablishing normal trade, bringing concluding more contracts between African consumers and Ukrainian suppliers of agricultural products, which Ukraine still has significant potential to provide. So, and from one hand, it will be useful and interesting for African partners. From other hand, it will help Ukraine to get more revenues, not only rely on the external aid, but to allow Ukraine to earn money ourselves, where we can do this in the most efficient way. So my conclusion would be it's just as sooner the war is over, as soon Ukraine restores its full territorial integrity, as soon restores its full capacity and full potential to produce various commodities and to supply them to Africa, the sooner this will bring more stability, both for Ukrainian economic recovery, but also for African further stability as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And this is absolutely crucial for, as you said, the role that Ukraine plays in terms of food security for several fragile countries. So that has to be absolutely tackled, and there should be no discussion on, unlocking, all these links and trades that were blocked for so many weeks, and will have also midterm repercussions for the continent's stability. Mr. Berlomo, I remember as a TTG, we did research on the future of EU development cooperation, and one of the challenges we realized from the interviews was that despite being, the biggest donor player at the global level, the European Union is not perceived as the key or in the top 5 of key donors from a lot of African countries. So you said that the Global Gateway is not just a rebranding of resources, but my question is, what is, and you mentioned that the goal is to make tangible projects on the ground with concrete results. We also listened before to one of the speakers saying that on the infrastructural side, there is not too much maybe done yet by the EU, or at least it's not perceived yet as a big actor. So what do you think are the key tangible areas in which, let's say, on next February, 1 year after the EU summit, you could already deliver some, not, of course, results, but at least some concrete steps that you have taken as EU, and, of course, as a service supporting the other director generals working on thematic areas?
Thank you for this question, which is indeed pertinent and relates both to the most recent crisis, but also to the broader picture. And you refer to the perception in many African countries about the role and the impact, actually, of the European Union. Too often, and of course, we have to be self-critical, first and foremost, in terms of our communication, which for too long has been focusing on the size of our support, instead of, let's say, looking at the deliverables and the impact that our support can make on the ground. So if I could dream about a study, like the cost of non-Europe in Africa, I mean, of course, we all measure what we did, of course, but it would be interesting to know what would be Africa today in terms of crisis, in terms of democracy, in terms of economic development, without the engagement of the European Union over the last 50 years, I would say. So I think that would be an interesting starting point. Then, of course, there is a lot that can be done in terms of communication, and that's where the Europe-Africa partnership can play a role, because this partnership is a combination of political dialogue, policy, and financial support. But there is also what we call a people-to-people dialogue, and we really welcome the engagement of non-state actors, civil society, the media, that they have a role to play into painting a different picture about the role of the European Union. And again, if I again can refer to the before mentioning a couple of concrete deliverables, which I think are extremely interesting, but allow me also again to refer to this battle of narratives on the sanctions, for instance, which is again, in my opinion, the result of perceptions rather than, or really, again, someone who's better than us in terms of circulating or promoting their own ideas. Because whenever I think the Russian propaganda claims, or whoever claims that the food crisis in Africa is the result of European sanction, this is nothing more than a cynical lie, like many others, been circulating over the years. And that's where, all our leaders from European member states and European institutions, was the case last week in New York in the General Assembly, are trying to debunk these narratives and try to explain. We're doing it at the leaders level, but we're also doing it on the ground. I can tell you that we have addressed letters, and we are engaging on the ground with our partner countries and asking them, please, and again, concrete examples, not theory, give us a concrete example, because we are ready to address it. If there is any impact from our sanctions, we are ready to try to find a solution. So please let us know whenever you think. To be honest with you, I doubt we have received one single reply to this request. So it means, once again, that against this narrative, there is not really something on the ground. Now, if I would refer to your question about these deliverables, and one that is very much linked to the COVID crisis, vaccine manufacturing. So someone should also not lose sight of the fact that, of course, a number of countries realized, including Senegal, Rwanda, South Africa, and others, Ghana, realized that dependency on pharmaceutical products and vaccine in particular was not sustainable. And we can hardly disagree with this. So I think that then they tried to address this issue. And I think, without I would prefer others to say so, but I think that this is happening because of the support of the European Union. Of course, there are a number of private companies, BioNTech and others, who are venturing in Africa, and without even one single euro of support from the public sector. They're doing it as private sector. But at the same time, we, and this was mentioned even in a number of statements from African leaders in the General Assembly, they acknowledged the role of the European Union in building the regulatory framework which allows a company like BioNTech or any other to operate in a given country. The creation and support of the Food and Drug authorities, yes. The WHO maturity level, a number of issues where the equipment of labs, which are not, very, talking about very sophisticated, not only in terms of the supply side, but also in terms of training of all the staff to operate these. So this is something which is, in my opinion, a game changer, which is the result of a so-called global gateway. So we can really come with a concrete deliverable already now, without even waiting next year. So this is already a reality on the ground. So I think, and going back to the broader picture, we have some homeworks in terms of public communication, in terms of engaging, in particular with the youth. I think that, if you look at the demographic trends, if you look at the social fabric, I think that we have a lot to do, a lot to engage with the youth. And that's what we're trying to do in many partner countries. And I can tell you that, we are trying to engage, we're trying to move away from these traditional, I would say, narratives about, of course, we all we cannot deny responsibilities of the past. But now I think it's time to work together, and in particular to work in the multilateral framework. And that's where I think also the European Union, but also in our partnership with the African Union and African member states, we're trying to highlight the importance of multilateralism. Of course, we can hardly address this global challenging, being COVID, being the impact of the aggression in Ukraine, in isolation. I think this, and it was mentioned earlier this morning, shows how interconnected we are. And as we are interconnected, we can only address these problems in a coordinated, complementary fashion, and in what we think is a multilateral umbrella, with the UN at its core, but of course with all the adjustment, of course. And we are also, again, self-critical about, and we are working towards innovation in a multilateral system, the seat of the African Union in G20. We strongly support it. You know, we want more inclusive multilateralism. And this is where I think we should aim at, instead of trying to divide, let's say, us, and being, let's say, victims, so to speak, or linked to the legacy of the past.
Yeah, thank you so much also for mentioning the issue of health, because I think in a context where, at least in the richest countries, the pandemic seems to be at least under control. We should never forget that in some regions of the world, in Africa especially, this is one of the elements that brought, you know, the frustration for the disparity, the inequality. And I think the European Medicine Authority could also play a big role for the African Medicine Authority, which was stuck for several years, and the pandemic accelerated the creation of the agency. So I think on this particular topic of public goods, the global gateway, the European Union should be more active and more vocal, because they could bring something that Chinese cannot bring on the table. So, and this is actually linked to the values we promote. I will go back to Dr. Hassan Kanenye. My question is, you mentioned very rightfully about you know, the ambiguity on international law, on human rights, on security, the destabilization of the security context in several regions, Sahel, but also Horn of Africa. In a few weeks, there will be an important forum taking place in Tana. What do you think should be the key message that we Europeans, in the attempt to build a more equal and more structural relation and more honest relation with the Africans, should, you know, listen to? I will be participating, and it would be interesting as a European to be in an African, you know, context where we have to listen to the needs. You mentioned the unconstitutional changes of governance, but there are a lot of topics on which we could and we should listen to in a better way to the African counterparts. Because as you said, Africa is ready to cooperate with several actors all over the world. We don't have a patent of, you know, privilege for the relations with the continent. So what do you think should be the messages and the lessons we should draw from this important event in a few weeks from now?
Thank you very much. You know, let me try to respond to that. Yes, soon, of course, there's going to be an engagement. Now, one of the things that I would probably like to speak to directly, it's important to increase, for instance, Ukrainian agencies when, insofar as the conflict is concerned. I absolutely agree with the speaker who mentioned that the agency of Ukraine has been missing, and that is why also the perception has been that Ukraine is a pawn between the East and the West in terms of the struggle. And I think when you do that, then the narrative of Ukraine itself and the humanity of it actually gets lost in translation. And so that is going to be important. And perhaps that also explains why when President Zelensky gave an address to the African Union, I think only 4 heads of state, you know, showed up, you know, and that actually goes to enforce the point I was trying to talk about. This month, the Polish president was visiting the African Union, and it looks like this kind of speech he gave, he was on a listening tour, at least that's how he framed it. If you go through his speech, is the kind of actually speech and ideas, even though, of course, Poland has also much longer history with the continent, that some of those ideas are going to be important in finding a way to communicate to Africans. But fundamentally, there are a number of issues that are plaguing the continent. One, of course, you have the current food crisis. Now, the current food crisis, of course, it will be disingenuous and dishonest to say that it's, you know, exclusively has been caused by the conflict. There have been underlying issues when it comes, for instance, to drought and famine, but also climate change, as well as the pandemic that has affected the ability of countries to do farming. But there's no denying that that conflict has contributed, especially on wheat-reliant countries as well as fertilizer-reliant countries. And Kenya comes into question. That's where I am right now. And I come from a farming place. Fertilizer right now is around $70 for 50 bags, for 50 kilos of fertilizer. That is way beyond the ability of an average farmer to actually do farming, especially when you have a couple of acres, to do that. So one thing that's going to be fundamental is, of course, the area of food. Second, there is a refugee problem. Europe, in particular, has looked at the refugee or migration problem from the continent from a security perspective, security lens. While, of course, right now we are looking at the refugees from Ukraine from a humanitarian lens. And that is very apparent to many Africans who are looking at, at it as if it's double standards. And so if we can have a common humanitarian approach, especially when it comes to the refugee or migration problem, because some of these are actually deserving. They're coming from conflict areas. They're coming from Eritrea. They're coming from Somalia. They're coming from places which you wouldn't even like yourself to live. So how can we have a more humane EU policy, EU-Africa policy when it comes to migration? Thirdly, it's important to discuss some long-term investments that are divorced from the geopolitical competition, especially the desire to respond to the actions of Russia or China when it comes to investment. That if we can be able to together have a discussion on how can we engage the continent more properly in ways that's going to be mutually interested. This is a continent in 2050 is projected that 1 in every 4 people in the world is going to be from the continent. And so how are we honestly going to have a long-term mutual strategy that is actually going to respond to these challenges? And perhaps in the final analysis comment, I would say, in the light, of course, of what is happening, whether it's the COVID, pandemic, vaccines and stuff like that, which many Africans looked at it as an extension of global apartheid. In case those in the West may not, be aware of that, it was perceived largely, especially during the time of hoarding of vaccines, that this is an extension of global apartheid, and no one really cares so much about us. Even though what is important in the long term is not to rely on pharmaceuticals per se, but to actually assist this continent or at least some key countries that have some capacity to develop local capacity to be able to produce this. And, a final note, I would say this. History is important, and in as much as we may want to dismiss it, and the Polish president and highlighted that a lot actually in his speech, and that is why I'm saying I think he was able to study the continent to be able to understand what to say and how. History is important, and so if we cannot be able to admit but then move on, or acknowledge some of what is coloring the Africa's perceptions, is going to be hard to make progress. And in polite company, people are not exactly going to share with you the truth, in part because there's a different cultural, in terms of communication between the global South and the Africans as well as the global North. A lot of times, sometimes people are not going to say certain things as direct as they want to. And so it may leave you an impression that someone is actually with you when they're actually not. And that is why you find sometimes their words or their actions do not exactly match the words, in part because you have different communication styles. And that is why part of the problem with communication has actually been has to do with the fact that we don't have different communication styles. There's high context culture communication and there's a low context culture communication. Finally, the messaging and the narrative. It's not about the Russian propaganda that is shaping Africa's thinking. That is sometimes actually being a little bit intellectually patronizing to the continent. It's also informed by the realities of the recent past. And that is why I'm saying it's not so much that actually Africans support Moscow or Moscow's actions. Absolutely not. In fact, Moscow is such a marginal player when it comes to economics and the opportunities they can be able to provide to the continent. And most Africans know that. But it is the dissatisfaction and disappointment of especially the leading countries in Europe, the Baltics, do not have that baggage. And that is why they're actually going by a good link of linking Europe, because they don't come with this history of contradictions. They have the good goals of Europe without the bad ghosts of colonialism and recent history or experience. However, generally, the EU-Africa relations can be improved and made more robust if we can honestly focus on mutual priorities, as well as have honest conversations on both the present, the past, as well as the future when it comes to where we want to go.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this issue of the interest and the need to find common interest rather than just focusing on values where double standards could be easily, identified from the past history is crucial. Before opening the floor for a quick Q&A, I will go back again to Patrick. And you said something which is crucial also for think tankers, like how to bring the complexity of discourses in a very fast decision-making process, or even debate, in the academic debate, but also in the broader debate with the public opinion. So, how do you think this, in the dialogue, especially with the institutions, this complexity should be brought forward in these days? I mean, you have also the experience from the ground because you lived in Senegal. How do you think the academia, the research world should work better with the institutions on the ground and in Brussels to bring this richer complexity to the debate? Because otherwise, as you said, narratives will always be, very simple: East, West, NATO, Russia, Europe, Russia, and there is something very much more complex inside. And also, as you said, the experience of new voices from the East, from the Central Eastern Europe, have to play a role. So what would be your suggestion on this?
So I'm probably not the best person to answer this question, simply because I don't work in the policy world. But my general sense is, thinking out loud almost here, is that we do need to be more inclusive. And I think Dr. Kanenge's remarks, for many people from Europe, from Eastern Europe, they are probably an eye-opener. I'm not sure that these concerns, critiques, are heard on a regular basis in Europe. And so it's very important to hear what African stakeholders have to say about these issues. Of course, if you live in Africa, you hear it. And I do think there is a difference between a diplomat who does hear things that are diplomatically framed and, for example, someone like myself who is an academic. I have, I think, slightly more frank conversations with my African friends. And it is definitely true that these concerns that we just heard are not necessarily well known in the policy world. And I do think at the end of the day, it's as simple as being more inclusive. That means when you organize events like this, and of course here, chapeau to the organizers for doing precisely that, bringing different perspectives to the table. You have to make sure that you do the extra work, that you find somebody who can articulate these concerns. So yeah, I guess from an institutional perspective, that is the core thing that I would emphasize. Yeah, maybe I'll just stop there also because we're running out of time, and maybe there are questions from the audience. Yep.
Thank you so much. We already have 1 from 2 questions, 3 questions, so we'll have the mic going around first. Yes. Oh, you were simultaneous, but yeah, Vince.
Thanks, Daniele. Thanks, everyone, for the session. Vince Chadwick from DevX. I'm a journalist. My first question to Mr. Tereshko, I'm not sure if you're able to give any more detail about the visit that's coming up in the next few days. I understand if you're not able to give that detail about where, when, and also why, perhaps. What's the aim of this visit? It's in the context of what we've been talking about as well, of your minister to Africa. And to Mr. Balomo, I wanted to ask about this notion that the EU sanctions have no impact on Africa. It's all Russian propaganda. We're losing the battle of messaging. in the famous, well, famous in some circles, heads of mission letter from Addis over summer, the representatives of the EU member states in the African Union wrote to headquarters and they said it's not enough to keep saying this. It's not working. And so we're in this kind of dialogue du sourd where Europe keeps saying it's all Russian propaganda, while, if I understand correctly, tweaking some of the sanctions at the margins as well. So I just wanted to really clarify how you see this issue. Is it the case that Europe really is been irreproachable on its approach to sanctions, would do the same thing over again? Or is there scope for a little bit of saying mea culpa at the margins without at all buying into, as you say, the Russian propaganda? It seems like Brussels has taken a very absolutist approach and said, well, everything we did was great and it's all Russian propaganda, but the heads of mission in Addis are saying something different. And so I just wanted to clarify how you see that. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's collect the two questions and then we will go back to the panelists. Yes?
Yes, thank you. I have a quick comment and a question. So I think what we've heard here, that a lot of this is linked to strategic communications. And this has been a topic that Estonia has been already starting a long time ago with the special group in EAS, in the External Action Service, that started towards the east. But I think, unfortunately, like we had for the East Stratcom, we don't have enough resources in that area, and we're also very slow to respond. So, for example, some of the points that were brought up by Hassan about Europe in general. Well, we were, for example, with France in mission in Bakan. Also, we were one of the first to join the EU mission in Central African Republic, which he was mentioning were for the causes from Libya. So, I mean, I think these types of points we don't understand. Even inside the European Union, Patrick brought up some points about Eastern Europeans not being in the picture enough, which some were very valid points. But we've already had an ambassador to Liberia. We just had the Estonian EU ambassador to just finished in South Africa, and we currently have the ambassador to Somalia. And I'm sure that our colleagues in Latvia and Lithuania have the similar coverage. So I mean, we are getting the access. Our Prime Minister Kaja Kallas has been on CNN, BBC. You know, she's out there passing the messages. So yes, it's been a slow in the Stratcom. We're getting there, but we really need more resources, and we need to respond quickly, because I think that's where we're the slowest. The other side gets their messages out before us, and then we're slow to answer. And sorry to be long, but my quick question is that there will be an international court after the war is ended. And for the court to be respected, that means our African friends also have to be supportive of the court process. So how do we, maybe to Hassan and Patrick, how do we convince, or how do we message to our African friends that this court has to take place after the war? Thank you.
Thank you. I have another question.
Thank you to the panel, and my name is Chahaya from the Africa Europe Foundation, so delighted also to be able to host this event and also to promote this kind of dialogue, which is ever more important. From my perspective, it might also reflect a little bit, again, on this whole conversation about narrative, about a dissonance between the way that things are presented or explained, but I think when it comes to the next month, we have COP27, we have the ongoing crisis in Ukraine and the ongoing energy crisis, which is only going to keep on becoming more and more exacerbated in the winter months. And we've seen a clear movement from the European camp, on the one hand, to maintain its position around the European Green Deal, about the kind of national determined commitments that we have for COP. At the same time, continuing to push African nations to leapfrog, to engage with the green transition, to ensure that there is this fast-paced movement to, climate neutrality. But then, of course, Europe looks at itself looking for energy sources in Algeria or with new partners in Africa. So I also wanted to hear the panel's comment about this kind of dissonance and the kind of communications that perhaps aren't hitting the mark, or perhaps there needs to be a little bit more open and honest dialogue when it comes to Europe's needs as well, and what does that entail for Africa's green transition? So very complex, apologies, but even just a comment is sufficient.
Okay. I don't see other questions, so maybe I can ask Nicola and Serhi to respond to the question raised by Vince, the two questions, and then I will ask Patrick and Hassan to respond, and also we can also try to reply to the question of the Green Deal and the implications. I can also ask Salius to intervene on that. So Nicola can start.
Well, very briefly on the sanctions. Thank you for the question, and this allows me also to make another point that very often we look at these sanctions like these are an European invention, that Europeans are the only one who to apply sanctions, because we are fully aware of the impact and the broader picture. But even at the African Union level, there are a number of instruments and tools, restrictive measures and sanctions already at that level. But that's another story. When it comes to the let's say the impact and the approach, I mean, I can hardly speak about the head of missions in Addis, but I think even HRVP referred only a few days ago to the sanctions as a weight reduction, kind of a diet, I think he mentioned, which takes time, can hardly produce. I think considering the sanctions, they are failing. It would be a big mistake if you look at the very short term. That we are convinced that these sanctions are really producing effects. And are likely and are part of the support to Ukraine, but we can hardly look at this in the very short term. And again, when it comes to potential spilling effect, spillover to African countries or even to other non-European countries, we are ready to engage. We launched that dialogue, and I can tell you, to the best of my knowledge, we have not received really concrete examples. On the contrary, we can be proud of what we are doing in supporting the Black Sea Grain Initiative, promoting the solidarity lanes, etc., to address issues that are potentially the result of not the sanctions, but of the war in Ukraine. So, and as even HRVP mentioned, and I think the ambassador earlier mentioned, it's worth mentioning that these solidarity lanes and the Black Sea grain, it's serving mainly African countries, not Europeans. As you know, we are not benefiting mainly from these. These products we are able to channel in spite of the war, and some might say in spite of the sanctions, are really reaching those more in need, meaning in African countries.
Yes. I cannot tell you the exact countries and exact dates, but it is going to happen very soon. And the overall idea that these are the countries of mostly sub-Saharan Africa, because we can Ukraine has still have strong diplomatic presence, more strong diplomatic presence in Northern Africa, and with well-sustained and well-established trade relations, in particular for agricultural goods. So the accent will be on sub-Saharan Central Africa, and which is also more important, despite we have few embassies across Africa, more than our Estonian and Latvian colleagues said in the morning. We have few, but the idea to have the visits to the places where we do not have diplomatic presence, and to establish ties over there or develop ties over there. So, and the idea first, yes, and the communication and is key, as these discussions proves that we have to convey in fact for us, it's kind of natural things that in fact we are standing for the things which in fact African countries are standing for their sovereign choices, for their right to define their own destiny, and to coordinate our efforts probably on the external arena, because for instance, it's sad irony again that African countries in big majority are shy to follow Western approach on the UN stage. But for instance, it's Ukraine is standing for reform of the United Nations Security Council with many other Western countries, and our president mentioning why the last week at the GA Assembly raised this issue that why African voice is not heard is not well present in the Security Council. Why Eastern European, Central Eastern European voice is not strongly present in the general Security Council level, and it's opposite. Russia is opposing this reform. Russia is willing to preserve this status quo, which is not satisfies neither Ukraine nor Africa. So even at this simple issues, we made to talk to each other to coordinate our position, and of course we want to bring more practice into our relations with Africa to talk about establishing stronger economic relation, linking us closer in terms of economy, trade, and logistics, and of course also to convey messages what efforts Ukraine is doing despite the war, in order to support Africa in terms of agricultural supplies. And for instance, despite war, Ukraine has provided humanitarian assistance to Somalia and Ethiopia, I believe, with grain, so not as a kind of trade, but as a humanitarian assistance. And this is also have to be communicated, and probably it is known on the overall expert level of, but not really felt and known on the ground. So we want to have closer ties with Africa, and the purpose of the visit is here. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll give the floor now to Hassan and then to Patrick for the question on the International Criminal Court. You're muted.
Am I muted?
No, no. It's okay now.
Okay, thank you. Yes. It is true that, for instance, the level of investments and support programs of the country from Europe is far more than what is actually known in public knowledge, either by the citizens of the ground or even officials in government. And so communication is certainly one thing that, of course, has to be done. But I think beyond that, I think to speak on two issues that I think are relevant insofar as Africa-EU relations are concerned, is the issue that we just mentioned about the establishment of an international court. To, of course, try what say perhaps those people who violated, human rights, in this conflict. One thing that's important to remember is what the current attitudes of Africans towards international courts, and you have to use the ICC as an example. At the outset, I think ICC had a lot of support from many Africans until they started. There was a growing perception that ICC was an instrument by powerful Western countries to use it against small, poor, especially African countries. And that feeling exactly has not disappeared. We have to be able to find a way of actually changing that narrative. Right now, the feeling is not as prevalent as it was about 5-10 years ago. However, it's still there. One thing that is going to be helpful is to make this organic and have it ownership, whether you want to use it through a General Assembly or just shuttle diplomacy, to be able to have an African buy-in from state to state level or from using regional blocks and creating justifications, perhaps in form of support of some kind of a tribunal and something like that. Now, one thing that is also going to be important, especially in creation of this, to be able to get African support, is it should not be constructed as a political or geopolitical witch hunt against, for instance, Moscow, because Africans right now are very shy, especially in taking a unilateral, very, what I would say adversarial approach towards Moscow, in part because of what I call the emerging Sino-Russian alliance, in which, of course, China is a big player on the continent. And so, because Africans are also very keenly aware of the kind of vulnerability that may put them into, it's going to be hard if it's framed as a court, for instance, not to try people who committed certain crimes, but let's say, that is targeted towards Moscow. Is going to be extremely hard to get an African support. On the climate agenda, Nairobi is the headquarters of the United Nations Environmental Programme. And part of the charter, part of the conversations and the discourse, especially in this part of the world, has been that advanced economies are asking the continent to do too much when they're not exactly prepared to do that, in part because they're still heavily reliant, especially on fossil fuels. They have not developed the capacity in terms of energy independence in green energy to be able to win themselves off that. And so there are certain targets being asked to meet that are just beyond the realm of reality, with especially give context in which they're expected to be met, especially when there is no funding with it. The countries on the continent, and especially in the Horn of Africa region, they are suffering the most when it comes to the effects of climate change. However, I don't think there is enough funding, enough money to be able to come up with programs, including even agriculture, that is going to actually be able to prevent this, not just in terms of energy. And so I think that is something that has to be, looked into with regard to what kind of exceptions or exemptions can we be able to give the continent, and within what time frame, to be able to actually get Africa also to buy into that, because they're the most affected by the current climate crisis that we are facing. Perhaps I think I'll stop at that and put it back to the moderator. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is fascinating. I really find these conversations enriching. The point about communications and narratives, I think this is so true. A lot of this boils down to communications, and here I do want to acknowledge that I do think that Eastern Europeans have been more present in the European structures, for example. I think that's a valid point. I actually worked for the External Action Service. I started 13 years ago, and at the time things were pretty bad. These things have definitely changed, and I also take your point about, for example, Estonian, Eastern European politicians featuring on CNN. So, I mean, the picture is certainly not all bleak. And I did say at the beginning that I am overgeneralizing slightly. I think the point stands, but the picture is certainly not bleak. And I do think there's also a distinction to be made here a little bit between the policy space and the academic space. I do feel that in general, when it comes to the policy space, Eastern European voices have actually been more prominent than I expected at the beginning of this war. I did feel that this would be sort of a case where Eastern Europe's concerns, Ukraine in particular, would be sort of brushed aside. And I do think that there was certainly a risk at the beginning that that would happen. But everybody was prepared to sort of, move on. But Ukraine forced Europe to really deal with this issue by defending itself so courageously. But in the academic space, I feel that there's really more scope for improvement in terms of sort of diversifying the discourse. On communications, though, I do want to make one point, and this will tie in with the substantive point about the special tribunal. I think we also have to be realistic about something. And that is that not everything can be agreed upon. I almost get a sense here that if we increase dialogue, if we communicate better, we will find common ground. And of course, that's the goal, right? And that is a hopeful note to end on. But I think realistically, there are certain challenges that will be very difficult to overcome. Certain differences of opinion. Especially I'm thinking here about values, right? Democracy, the role of democracy on the European continent versus the role of democracy on the African continent. And, increasingly, these are going to be difficult conversations. Human rights is another issue, right? Human rights, a very polarizing issue where there are differences of opinion where I don't think there's an easy way to find common ground. Now, moving on to it's my role as an academic to be a little critical, and so I can't just be positive about communication. But now moving on to the substantive point about the special court, the special tribunal, and this I think will maybe confirm what I just said. I do think it's going to be difficult because I think you asked the question, the ambassador to Estonia, that we need to get people to buy into this special tribunal. I happen to work on international criminal law. This is what I do full time. And you know, I think that this special tribunal is controversial for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to get into right now. I mean, let's be clear. I want to hold Vladimir Putin accountable for the crime of aggression. The special tribunal is a tribunal that is proposed for the crime of aggression specifically. It's not for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. For that, we have the International Criminal Court, which is already in The Hague, and those crimes are being investigated. There's a proposal to set up a separate tribunal for the crime of aggression that would deal specifically with Russian aggression, you know, this case of aggression, one of the first since World War II, one of the most blatant violations of Article 2.4 since World War II. Now, the difficulty is getting everybody to agree that we need another tribunal, that we need to set up a separate court to deal with this single case. And I see the value in this, let's put it this way, as an academic who is observing this discussion. And I know that Eastern European countries are pushing very hard for this. Poland, the Baltic states in particular, Ukraine also. And there is more ambiguity among Western European states, it has to be said, Western European states, and then the third world, the global south. Now, substantively, it's a very complicated conversation. I'm not going to get into the legal parameters of this tribunal because that's not what we're here for, but it's a complicated conversation, especially when it comes to immunities. African states have serious concerns about immunities under international law and how this tribunal would relate to that. But then the other problem that I've noticed, and I'll end on this, is that we have been talking a lot about the special tribunal for people who follow this conversation, international lawyers in particular. And there is this push from certain countries to establish a special tribunal for the crime of aggression. And yet we have heard very little, to be frank, about how this tribunal is supposed to operate. And this is a core question, right? It's really about the institutional design of the tribunal. This has been shrouded in mystery. And so to me, a little bit, I have to say, for the time being, this is almost sort of sort of like you know, something that we're trying to sell. Either you're for or against the tribunal, but I don't think that it's as simple as that. We have to actually know what it is that we're buying into, what it is that we're trying to convince people to buy into, and that conversation, unfortunately, has not been had. And until that conversation happens and we see, you know, the blueprint, what are we proposing, and what is it that other states are supposed to support? I don't think this conversation is going to move forward.
Thanks, Patrick. We are running out of time, so we'll have to close the panel. But I would like to thank all the panelists who came here today. I think I learned a lot from this conversation, and I can only say that it's important also for us as think tankers to bring new voices in our internal debate on these issues on EU-Africa relations, and I'm grateful that I had the chance today to learn a lot of interesting insights from you all, digitally or physically. I would also like to thank Africa and Africa Euro Foundation for hosting the event, and now I'll give the floor to you, Kenya, for the final thoughts, but thanks so much.
I'll be very, very brief because I know we are over time. So just a quick round of thank yous. So first of all, thank you, New Partners Initiative, for sponsoring this, Africa Europe Foundation, Friends of Europe, and especially I want to thank the team of Africa. So it's Lucas, Julia and Birgit over there. A round of applause, please, for the team. And I also want to thank the other team, Nicolas, Chahaya, if I'm correct, and Alessandra. Thank you so much. A round of applause for them. And thank you so much for all the distinguished speakers. Thank you, Hassan, for joining us digitally. It was a pleasure. And thank you, our colleagues from Estonia and Latvia, for being with us in the morning. And thank you, the audience, for being here, for asking the questions. I'm really happy we had this dialogue and we opened, hopefully, some new ideas and gave some food for thought for everybody. Thank you.